I've spent a lot of time locked up. I don't mean in prison, I mean, for example, 3 years working in Afghanistan as a Canadian diplomat, where due to the security situation of lots of threats of kidnappings or targeted attacks, our lives were mostly restricted to the shipping container where I lived, the cafeteria, and the office next door. I was motivated there, doing work that was meaningful, but the world got smaller. From the room to the canteen to the office, and the single-minded focus on the work, which made the world feel smaller still. I think many of us can relate to that myopia that comes about when you're under stress, when you're working on something important for you, and when you can only see what's right there in front of you. Back then in Afghanistan, there were many times also when there was an imminent attack and we all had to run to the bunkers while the Canadian Armed Forces and our security teams would rush up to defend us. I'll never forget the confusion and stress of an incoming alert in the middle of a workday or in the dark of night, and squatting down in between concrete berms in your pajamas, wearing a red headlamp, and waiting and wondering what's going to happen. Each time it was an experience of profound uncertainty and fear. It gets to all of us after a while. So maybe you noticed I said us. And that's because when I was invited to come to KIMEP for a TEDx, I was trying to think, what's something I have to offer to these students who are going out into the world? And I thought about finding a way through uncertain times. And I thought some of my experiences from Afghanistan and around the world might be relevant to you. But I was surprised when I sat down to write the speech and thought the word us kept coming up. Because of course, while running to a bunker is not a very common experience, dealing with confusion, with risk, with uncertainty, this is a very, very human experience that we all share. It's something, that feeling of focus as well, that when you're under pressure, you can just focus on the one thing and do your best, that tunnel vision. This is something I'm sure we've all experienced at some time in our lives. These days, the state of the world, I'm sure, is on all of our minds. Climate change, economic crisis, conflict, who knows what else. For students, I can imagine for young people, it's even more difficult to figure out, where will my life lead me in such a world? What can I do? And you can't turn away from it because it's on your phones in vivid detail 24/7. What do you hold on to in times of uncertainty? How do you feel centered when the world seems to be falling apart? When I think back to my experiences, the first thing that occurs to me is the people. Because sitting in those bunkers, I'll never forget the hugs, the encouragement from friends and colleagues from different walks of life, comforting me and being comforted in turn. While the circumstances were unusual, I think reaching out to community, to loved ones, to friends, to partners is something very human and very common that affects all of us. Now, if I think back to the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, I was back in Ottawa, very different context, but the early days of COVID brought back those memories of a confined life in Afghanistan. Do you remember early in 2020 when nobody knew what the virus was about? Is it like nothing? Or is it a super flu? Or zombie apocalypse? Right? We didn't know what it was. We were all facing this kind of fear. And what did we do? We reached out for our people, for friends, family. We found comfort in each other all around the world. You remember the people in Italy singing opera to each other on the balconies? Or in New York, everyone banging pots and pans at, I think it's 6 p.m., out of appreciation for the doctors, the nurses, the first responders. And the Zoom calls and virtual anything at all to stay connected. I was on nightly calls with friends, with family, a great source of comfort, even just to share our fears and share our theories about what was happening. Just like being on deployments overseas, where these calls back to family, or these chats with the team were such an important way we got through it, found clarity, found our center. So hold on to your people. Sometimes it's also just as hard to figure out where you are when the world seems topsy-turvy. To give you my example, back when I started working in Kandahar as part of the international mission to build a secure Afghanistan, the war was confusing. We were doing a lot of good things. We were supporting good governance, development, the rights of women, but every day we had more obstacles. My job was to meet with elders from all the communities, sit down with them, and try to encourage them to share with me their brutally honest opinions about the situation, about what was happening, about what we needed to do, and to try to turn this advice into something useful for our strategy. And perhaps to also show them that we were listening and that this very powerful international coalition that had turned their world upside down was trying to do better, was trying to help. It wasn't easy always to hear their criticism and indeed their anger at the violence and destruction of the war. But it also didn't make sense for us to think that we had everything figured out, that we had all the answers. It was important to listen to the views of the people most affected, even when it was difficult. So keep an open mind. With everything going on in the world right now, it's very easy, I think, to retreat to our bubbles. And the algorithms are not helping, where they feed us what we already like or what we already want to hear. But I think we get more out of giving ourselves access to a diversity of voices and points of view. So keep close to friends that disagree with you. Embrace the different personalities in your family, in your friend group, in your workplace, because more than ever, when things are confusing, I think a diversity of views help you see things clearly. So keep an open mind. We're not done yet. You've also got to know what you stand for. A couple of years after Afghanistan, I was in Colombia. I was a humanitarian worker at that time with the Red Cross. And every week we would go up into the mountains in an area contested by the government, by the rebels. We would go where the road ends, and after that by horse, and after that by mule. And I saw every day the suffering of the conflict there. Family members gone, children taken, no heroes, no villains, just the suffering of conflict. And what protected me in those days was not a flak jacket or a bodyguard. We travel unarmed in the Red Cross, but the Red Cross on my shirt, or maybe more specifically what it represents. Neutrality, impartiality, independence, and a commitment to upholding the common humanity of every person. These fundamental principles of the Red Cross, they've been around for a long time, and they preserve the space for humanitarian action even when things are very contested. And they helped me and my team understand what we were trying to do and how we were going to do it. They're not my ideas. They've been around for 160 years, but they've kept humanitarians safe, grounded, and centered in the midst of very challenging circumstances. So I think there's something we can take from that as well. Be clear on what's important to you, on what values you've taken from your upbringing, from your schooling, from your life experiences, and hold on to these principles, especially when things are getting crazy, when you're faced with difficult choices. If the world seems mad, hold on to your principles. Later, I lived in Juba in South Sudan, this time as Ambassador of Canada, and I was faced with another conflict. And once again, I was living on a compound, confined with my colleagues in a small space, under pressure from the isolation, the confinement, under pressure from the security situation, under pressure from the suffering we saw and our desire to help, but not always being able to do everything we wanted to do to help. And frankly, under pressure in my own head, doing it to myself. Under difficult conditions, I was faced with personal and professional catastrophes, tragedies, partially of my own doing all at once. And I was overwhelmed. I didn't know where to go. And a very wise mentor jumped in at that moment and said to me, hold on to yourself, Alan. We're all human. We do the best we can. And when we screw up, there's a time for reflection and improvement. Do the work, yes, but also be kind to that little child inside of you and hold on to yourself. So here in Kazakhstan, my life is obviously very different from these other places I told you about. I have a comfortable life. We have a great team in Astana. We're making great progress on our priorities here. And Now this country is confronted with a reckoning on domestic violence. After the tragedies in recent weeks that are almost incomprehensible in Astana and around the country. The public has erupted with a call for action. The government has acknowledged more needs to be done. And faced with these difficult issues, I say, hold on to your courage. Difficult issues need brave people who can take action to build a brighter future for every woman and girl. Tomorrow is the launch of the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence. You may have heard of this international campaign to raise awareness about domestic violence and the need to ensure that no woman lives in fear. So I know that the brave survivors, activists, and officials who are calling for change, they will not be deterred. Change will come. We can all be a part of it. So hold on to your courage. And through this courage, through our principles, through holding on to our people, keeping an open mind, and being kind to ourselves, I know that a better world is possible. Thank you, merci.